Ukraine's history is one marked by centuries of foreign domination and tragedies, which ultimately culminated in Ukraine becoming a free nation in the late 20th century. But how did they get to that point? Where did the Ukrainians come from? And what happened to them throughout their long history? Well, those are all questions I'm going to be answering in today's video with the history of the Ukrainian people. Now, before we start, I just want to say that I understand this is probably going to be a somewhat controversial video, as I'm sure you can tell by the accent I am not Ukrainian, nor in fact am I Russian, by ancestry or otherwise. So I acknowledge I may not fully understand the complex, personal relationship between these two nations. However, in this video I will merely try my best to state the facts as I've found them, but if I do get anything wrong, feel free to correct me in the comment section. But with that out of the way, let's get straight into the video with the beginnings of the Ukrainian people. Ukrainians, in combination with Russians and Belarusians, can originally all trace their lineage back to the East Slavs, which emerged from the early Slavs during the Slavic migrations of the 6th and 7th centuries. During this time, the already well-established early Slavs began migrating out of their original homeland, which was likely somewhere in Central or Eastern Europe, with no single definitive homeland being agreed upon by researchers. Regardless of exactly where they came from, the East Slavs split off from the rest of the early Slavs and began rapidly spreading through Eastern Europe in two streams, in the wake of the fall of the Hunnic and Gothic dominance in the area. One group of these tribes settled along the Dnieper River in what is now Ukraine and Belarus, from which they then spread further northward into the northern Volga Valley, east of modern-day Moscow, as well as westward to the basins of the northern Dniester and southern Bur rivers, in present-day Ukraine. Sorry if I'm butchering these pronunciations, by the way. Another group of East Slavs also moved to the northeast, where they encountered the Varangians, who, for those unaware, were essentially Viking conquerors, traders, and settlers mainly from modern-day Sweden, where they would go on to establish the important regional centre of Novgorod for protection. This same Slavic population then also settled the present-day Tver Oblast and region of Beluzero in modern-day Western Russia. It was in this area that this group linked up with the other Dnieper group of Slavic migrants around present-day Rostov. Eventually, the majority of these East Slavs became incorporated into the Kievan Rus, whose exact origins are hotly debated, with some arguing that the term is of Varangian origin, while others argue it is Slavic. Regardless of the origins of the name, it seems that the leaders of the Kievan Rus, at least the first few, were in fact Varangian chieftains, though the land they ruled over was primarily inhabited by the Eastern Slavs. The Kievan Rus eventually expanded significantly, mainly through the conquest and annexation of many surrounding territories, likely incorporating many more Eastern Slavs into their kingdom, which, during the reign of Vladimir the Great during the late 10th to early 11th centuries, became the largest state in Europe at the time, boasting a population of more than 5 million people. Under the rule of Vladimir, Kiev emerged as one of the wealthiest commercial cities in Europe, benefiting from its strategic location on trade routes and growing its political influence. Also during his rule, Vladimir, though initially supporting the worship of pagan Slavic gods such as Perun, eventually made the decision in 988 to convert the Kievan Rus to Christianity, adopting Eastern Orthodoxy from the Byzantine Empire, with himself personally leading the baptism of the people of Kiev in the Poichena River. Despite the empire's flourishment during his life, following the death of Vladimir, the empire was marked by internal divisions created by each of his sons vying for power, which culminated in many large cities asserting their independence. Fortunately for the Rus though, the man considered to be one of the Kievan Rus' most capable leaders, also named Vladimir, soon emerged, and from 1113 to 1125 served as Grand Prince of Kiev and worked diligently to stabilize the fragmented territories of the kingdom, with remarkable success, achieving relative unity throughout the lands once more. This continued into his son Mstislaw's reign. However, following his death, the principality once again became fractured. The fall of the Kievan Rus altogether would eventually come with the invasion of the Mongols, who, despite initially being repelled at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, returned 15 years later in larger numbers under the leadership of Batu Khan, and laid siege to Kiev in 1240, which ultimately fell after a brutal assault, marking the final collapse of the Kievan Rus as a unified political entity. As a result of this invasion, the Mongols established dominion over the region through the Golden Horde, transforming most of the principality's former lands into tributary states. From the 13th century onwards, following the fall of the Kievan Rus, various parts of the coastline of what is now Ukraine also became dominated by the Republic of Genoa, which established numerous colonies around the Black Sea. Later on during the 14th century, Poland and Lithuania waged wars against the Mongol invaders, gradually reclaiming territories, and as a result of this, most of Ukraine came under the control of Poland and Lithuania. To be specific, Poland gained control and absorbed the areas of Red Ruthenia around present-day Lviv, as well as the surrounding areas of Volhynia and Podolia. Lithuania, on the other hand, gained control over Polotsk, Chernihiv, and Kiev, as well as the remaining parts of Volhynia. Eventually, Poland extended its influence over southwestern Ukraine, and after the Polish-Lithuanian Union, which began in 1385, Poles, Germans, Lithuanians, and Jews began migrating to the region, displacing Ukrainians from positions of authority that they had previously shared with Lithuanians. This led to an increased migration of Ukrainians towards central Ukraine. During this time, Polish migration combined with policies of Polonization and other forms of repression increasingly marginalized Ukrainians and intensified their cultural and political subjugation. It was due to this marginalization that in 1490 a series of rebellions broke out, led by Ukrainian leader Petro Mucha. His forces, which included early Cossacks, Hutsuls, and Romanians launched a series of successful uprisings known as Mucha's rebellions. The rebels would go on to capture several cities in western Ukraine and advance as far as Lviv, though they failed to take it, before eventually being confronted by a force of Polish army soldiers, a levy en masse of Galician magnates, and Prussian mercenaries at the Battle of Rohatin in present-day Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast. The rebel army suffered a crushing defeat and most of the rebels were killed. However, Mucha survived and fled back to present-day Romania with the other survivors, before returning to Galicia, which, just to clarify here, we are talking about the historical Galician region in what is now western Ukraine, not the one in Spain, if that wasn't already obvious, in 1942, and being captured in an unsuccessful attempt to stir up another rebellion before supposedly dying in a prison in Krakow. It was also during this period in the 15th century where the decline of the Golden Horde, caused by infighting amongst the Mongols, resulted in the establishment of the Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the Ottoman Empire which controlled much of the Black Sea coastline and the southern steppes of Ukraine, and would eventually go on to engage in a vast slave trade, ultimately exporting approximately 2 million slaves from Russia and Ukraine to the Ottoman Empire and the Middle East between 1500 and 1700. Back in western Ukraine though, following the official formation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569, Ukraine came under Polish administration, which marked a significant shift in the region's political and social landscape, as there was a renewed effort to colonize the lands of Ukraine. This period saw a significant portion of the Ukrainian nobility becoming Polonized, adopting Polish customs, language, and converting to Roman Catholicism, while in contrast the majority of the Ruthenian-speaking peasants remained loyal to Eastern Orthodoxy, resulting in growing social tensions. At the same time, brutal and harsh conditions imposed on the Ruthenian peasants sparked widespread resistance, culminating in many fleeing serfdom and seeking freedom in the borderlands where they became known as Cossacks, and quickly gained a reputation for their martial prowess and independence. Despite the Cossacks' many contributions to the Commonwealth's military efforts in the decades following, they were consistently denied any substantial political or social autonomy, with the ruling class seeing them largely as a disruptive force and attempting to transform them into serfs. This ongoing marginalization and denial of rights fueled a series of Cossack uprisings as they sought to defend their autonomy and way of life, ultimately laying the foundations for more significant conflicts between the Cossacks and the Commonwealth, which ultimately resulted in the establishment of the Cossack Hetmanate as an entirely independent state following the Treaty of Zborov in 1649. Unfortunately for the Cossacks, they emerged during a period of much turmoil in Eastern Europe, and soon found themselves under protection of the Tsardom of Muscovy, which would ultimately become Russia, when in 1654 the Zaporozhian host, seeking to escape Polish influence, entered into the Pereyaslav agreement with the Muscovans. Despite their initial hopes for autonomy, the Cossacks soon found themselves struggling to maintain sovereignty as Moscow sought to expand its influence. To make matters worse, in an effort to regain control over Ukrainian territories, the Commonwealth attempted to compromise with the Cossack state through the Treaty of Hadiach in 1658. Yet, after 13 years of continuous warfare, the Truce of Andrusovo in 1667 divided Ukraine between Poland and Muscovy, splitting the country along the Dnieper River. Although the Cossacks retained a degree of autonomy, this decision marked the beginning of yet another long period of foreign dominance over Ukrainian lands. The Cossack Hetmanate did however have one last hurrah, and reached its peak independence under Hetman Ivan Mazepa, who sought to align with the Swedish Empire and break free from Russian dominance during the Great Northern War in the early 18th century. Sadly for the Cossacks and anyone holding out hope for Ukrainian self-determination, Mazepa's rebellion ended in disaster at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, after which Moscow significantly tightened its control before abolishing the office of Hetman completely in 1764, marking the official end of the Cossack Hetmanate. After the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 1774, in which Ukrainian Cossacks played a vital role supporting the Russian Empire, a dramatic shift occurred. Following the Russian victory, Russia was granted significant territorial gains along the Black Sea coast, as well as control over parts of the Ottoman Empire's sphere of influence. This victory, while strengthening Russia, diminished the strategic importance of the Zaporozhian Sich, which, if you remember correctly, were the Ukrainian Cossacks who made the deal with Russia initially, because the borderlands the Cossacks had traditionally defended were now under Russian control, which paved the way for the destruction of any Ukrainian Cossack autonomy remaining. And in 1775, Russian troops under General Peter Tekeli marched on the Zaporozhian Sich, following orders from the Empress Catherine the Great, intent on centralizing the empire and removing any threats to their power. After a swift operation, the enormously outnumbered Ukrainians fell quickly, with their last leader being arrested and exiled. The destruction of the Sich marked the end of an era for the Cossack state, a symbol of Ukrainian independence and military prowess. The Russians would ultimately get their hands on the remainder of Ukraine controlled by Poland, following the collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian state and the second partition of Poland. By the end of Catherine's reign, most of Ukraine had fallen under Russian control, bringing an end to the centuries-old struggle for autonomy and leaving the Ukrainian people under the rule of the Tsar. Not all Ukrainians came under Russian authority, however, as during this time the Austro-Hungarian Empire was also home to a large minority of Ukrainians, with around 2.4 million living under Habsburg rule, primarily in eastern Galicia. Unfortunately for these Ukrainians, this region remained one of the poorest in Europe, and to put things simply, was stuck in the Middle Ages more or less. Nonetheless though, the Greek Catholic Church in Galicia became a key institution in preserving Ukrainian culture and fostering national identity. Likewise, the first Ukrainian language newspaper launched in the area in 1848, symbolizing the growing sense of nationalism among Ukrainians. It is also worth noting that due to the poor conditions, many Ukrainians from Galicia and other Austrian territories emigrated to North and South America during this period, seeking economic opportunities and escaping poverty. Throughout the 19th century, this aforementioned growing nationalism among Ukrainians continued to grow, both in Austria-Hungary and Russian-controlled Ukraine. In the late 19th century, Ukrainians in Galicia formed the Supreme Ruthenian Council and began advocating for autonomy and reforms. Likewise, in Russian Ukraine, underground networks spread literature, education, and national ideas among the peasantry. Things continued along those lines for the remainder of the 19th century and early 20th century, until the outbreak of World War I, which saw nearly 4 million Ukrainians take up arms. 3.5 million with the Russian army and 250,000 with the Austro-Hungarians. Tragically, that fact predictably resulted in many Ukrainians fighting each other on the battlefield. Ukrainian suffering was not limited to the military during this period, however, as many Ukrainian civilians became the victims of war crimes, with many being shot and killed by armies, accusing them of collaborating with the opposing armies. As the war dragged on and Russia's military inferiority became painfully apparent, as I'm sure many of you know, the Russian Revolution broke out, led by Vladimir Lenin, with the aim of overthrowing the Tsar and making Russia a communist state. During this period between 1917 and 1919, several Ukrainian republics declared their independence. However, none of these were able to resist the Bolshevik onslaught for long, and by 1921, Bolshevik forces had largely crushed any organized resistance, paving the way for Ukraine's full integration into the newly founded Soviet Union. When all things were said and done, it is believed that around 1.5 million Ukrainians had died as a result of World War I and the Russian Civil War. Fortunately for the Ukrainians under the Soviet Union though, things initially seemed to have gone quite well, at least in terms of being free to express their own culture, as shortly following its absorption into the Bolshevik state, the Soviet government implemented a policy of Ukrainianization as part of its broader strategy to strengthen support for their regime in non-Russian republics. This policy encouraged the use of the Ukrainian language in education, government, and media. Ukrainian culture and history were promoted to win over the local population and the intellectual elite, with the policies also resulting in Ukrainian literature, theatre, and arts experiencing significant growth. Tragically, as it seems to so often been the case for Ukraine, things would not be going so well for long, as following Joseph Stalin's assumption of power, the Soviets launched a campaign of forced collectivization across the USSR, including Ukraine, with the aims of consolidating individual peasant farms into large, state-controlled collective farms in the hopes of increasing agricultural productivity and securing grain supplies for rapid industrialization, policies which would prove to have catastrophic results for the Ukrainians. Ukrainian peasants understandably resisted these changes, which the Soviets responded to with brutal force, seizing land, livestock, and grain and deporting or executing those who resisted. Collectivization led to widespread chaos in rural areas, as agricultural output plummeted due to poor planning, lack of incentives, and resistance from the peasantry. The disruption of traditional farming practices and the state's requisition of grain only exacerbated food shortages. These food shortages ultimately led to what I imagine would have resembled hell on earth in most parts of Ukraine, save the far west. The Holodomor, as it came to be known in Ukraine, ultimately ended in the deaths of between 3.5 to 5 million people, according to current estimates, during just a single year between 1932 to 1933. Entire towns were wiped out, reminiscent of the days of the Black Death, with the impact of the famine being so great that its effects still persist in Ukraine to this day. Sadly, the horrors for Ukraine would not be over for some time, as it seems also often the case for them, as Ukraine would prove to be one of the worst hit countries by the Second World War later in the century. When Germany and its allies launched Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, Ukraine quickly became one of the main battlegrounds of the conflict, as German forces occupied large parts of the country, including major cities such as Kiev, Odessa, and Lviv. The German occupation, while initially seen by some as a potential liberation from the Soviets, quickly turned brutal. As I'm sure would not surprise most of you, due to the Germans' extreme racial ideologies, Ukraine to them was seen as a critical part of its plan for Lebensraum, or living space, and exploitation of resources. Now, just as a side note, I know I'm saying Germans in this video, however I'm aware that not all Germans were extremists, for the lack of a better word, nor even were the majority of Wehrmacht soldiers necessarily. I'm just saying German as a catch-all term in the hopes that the algorithm and YouTube won't destroy this video. With that little tangent out the way though, back during the war it is estimated that around 4.5 to 6 million Ukrainians fought in the Soviet Red Army, which was about 20% of the Red Army's entire forces, contributing significantly to their ultimate victory. The victory over the German war machine would come at an extremely hefty cost for Ukraine, as it is believed between 5 to 7 million Ukrainians were killed during the war, with between 4 to 5 million being civilians, including 1.5 million Jews, which essentially eradicated the pre-war Jewish population of Ukraine, while the remaining 1.4 to 2.5 million were killed serving in the Red Army. These numbers ultimately resulted in Ukraine losing approximately 16 to 17% of its pre-war population, making it one of the most devastated regions in the war, up there with the likes of Poland. In the following decades after World War II, Ukraine saw ups and downs in terms of its autonomy within the USSR and separation from Moscow. And by 1990, the cause for Ukrainian sovereignty and independence from the USSR had reached a fever pitch, fueled by decades of cultural suppression, economic exploitation, and a growing national consciousness among Ukrainians. In March 1991, a referendum on preserving the Soviet Union was held, and in Ukraine, 81% of the voters approved of the idea of Ukrainian independence, separate from the USSR. Later that year, on August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament officially declared Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union, which was followed by a further referendum later in the year where over 90% of voters supported independence, with majorities in every region, including historically more Russian regions such as Crimea. I'm afraid now, however, we are getting into very modern and very controversial topics which I would rather not cover in this video, and no, I am not simply talking about the ongoing conflict, so I think this is where I'm going to end it. Despite what I just said, I know this video will probably end up being slightly controversial regardless, but I hope the majority of you see that I was merely just representing the facts as I see them throughout Ukraine's complicated history, and try to limit my own personal opinions or views in any of this. With that being said though, thank you guys for watching. I'm actually thinking about making this a series where I could cover many countries or ethnic groups, so if you'd like to see me do another country, leave it in the comments. But with that all being said, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more from me, and I hope you all have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you all in the next one.